Pay double or get back to economy. That's what they told him, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. A black man clutching his first-class ticket while the flight attendant smirked like he was some intruder who didn't belong. The other passengers went quiet, watching, pretending not to enjoy the show. He felt every eye on him, every unspoken question of why he thought he deserved to be there. But this flight had just begun, and so had the reckoning that would leave them all speechless before it was over. Want to see how it ends? Stick around. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you'd do in his place. If you're enjoying these stories, hit like and subscribe. We'd love to have you here for the next chapter. The sun burned over the shimmering tarmac as travelers spilled through the jet bridge into the plane, each greeted with the careful choreography that Airline sold as first-class hospitality. Flight attendants stood at the entrance with perfect posture and plastic smiles, scanning boarding passes with laser precision. "Welcome aboard, sir," they chirped to the man in a navy suit with silver hair. "So glad you're flying with us today, ma'am," they'd beam at the lady balancing a designer tote. Their voices were honey-dipped, their eyes sparkling with customer service enthusiasm. But when Michael approached, a black man in his late 30s, wearing an understated charcoal blazer and pressed slacks, the lead flight attendant's smile barely flickered. She glanced at his ticket without really seeing it and tilted her head to the side, her voice dropping to a flat, dismissive monotone. "Economy is that way," she said, gesturing vaguely down the narrow aisle behind him. He blinked once, holding his ticket out in calm disbelief. The bold lettering read First Class C2A in crisp black font, but she didn't lean closer or bother to read it carefully. Instead, she shifted her weight impatiently, scanning the line behind him, making sure everyone could see he was holding things up. Michael's jaw tensed, but he kept his tone even. "Actually, I'm in first. 2A. She lifted an eyebrow, but didn't correct herself or apologize. Instead, she shrugged in a practiced, world-weary way that told everyone around them she'd seen this before and wasn't impressed. She snatched the ticket from his fingers, gave it a perfunctory beep with her scanner, then shoved it back at him without eye contact. "Sure," she said. "Find your seat." He moved forward, the line parting around him with the embarrassed silence of people who had overheard but didn't want to get involved. As he walked past the first few rows of economy, he felt eyes on him, some curious, some hostile, a few sympathetic, but none willing to say a word. He kept his chin level, unwilling to show that his pulse was thudding in his ears. As he entered the first-class cabin, the vibe shifted even more sharply. The lighting was warmer, the space more generous, but the atmosphere felt brittle. Passengers settled into wide leather seats, tucking away briefcases, adjusting their champagne flutes. A suited businessman glanced up at Michael and quickly averted his eyes, clutching his tablet tighter. A young couple in tailored travel wear exchanged a fleeting glance, the woman's lips pursing slightly before she returned to her phone. Michael placed his carry-on in the overhead bin with deliberate care, ignoring the hush that followed him down the aisle. He settled into 2A, exhaling a tight breath. He told himself to let it go. He'd traveled often enough to know the routine. Keep your head down, don't give them an excuse. He pulled out his phone and tapped idly at a blank note, trying to look occupied. But the silence was soon punctured by the flight attendant reappearing at his shoulder. "Sir," she said, voice syrupy but cold. "Just so you know, there's a line behind you. Let's try not to hold things up next time. Okay." Her words weren't loud, but her tone carried, a practiced stage whisper for maximum humiliation. He looked up slowly, studying her face. The smirk was there, fleeting but real. He held her gaze a moment too long. She shifted, annoyed, then turned on her heel to greet the next passenger. Further down the line, at the jet bridge, Michael heard a gate agent cackling. He was really confused about his seat. "Huh," someone said. "Poor guy must have wandered up here by accident." Michael's fingers clenched around his phone, but he kept his expression neutral. A few minutes later, as the rest of first class filled in, he watched the same attendant greet each new arrival with exaggerated charm. She held boarding passes delicately, laughed at dumb jokes, even brushed lint off a VIP's shoulder. She called a silver-haired banker sir 3 times in one sentence, eyes twinkling. Then she caught sight of Michael watching her, and her expression cooled instantly. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen it before, the subtle switch that turned people from professional to policing in an instant. The seat was wide, the service was supposed to be personal, but the space felt claustrophobic now. He adjusted the small pillow behind his back and tried to pretend he didn't notice the hush every time he moved. When drink service began before takeoff, she skipped his row at first, offering orange juice and champagne to the couple in 1B and the older woman across the aisle. When Michael cleared his throat politely, she turned as if startled. "Oh, I'll be right back," she said flatly, but she didn't come back for another 10 minutes. Finally, she arrived with a tray, not offering the choices, but shoving a half-full cup of water onto his tray table. "Here you go," she said. No apology, no smile. Then she turned on her heel without waiting for a response. He looked down at the water, biting back the angry retort on his tongue. It wouldn't help. He'd learned long ago that pushing back now would only make him the problem. He'd be the disruptive one, the rude one, the angry one who didn't know his place. Instead, he closed his eyes and counted to 10, but his pulse wouldn't slow. This was supposed to be first class. He had paid for this. He deserved better, but they'd made sure, before he even sat down, to remind him exactly how they saw him. Michael exhaled slowly as the plane doors sealed shut with a hollow thunk, the hiss of pressurization filling the cabin as if to seal in the mood. He tried to let the sting of the gate agent's smug grin fade, tried to ignore the way the attendant's eyes had glinted with challenge when she welcomed him on board. He told himself it was over, that once they were airborne, he'd be treated like everyone else who paid the absurd premium for this seat. That hope lasted exactly 3 minutes. She returned as the plane taxied, her heels clicking on the plush carpet, the tray in her hands rattling faintly with drink glasses meant to soothe the first-class elite. Michael had steeled himself for forced politeness, maybe an icy smile. Instead, she stopped just short of his armrest and looked down at him as if seeing an intruder who'd slipped past security. She didn't offer a drink menu. She didn't ask what he wanted. Instead, she snapped, "You'll need to settle the first-class service fee before we continue." Her voice wasn't quite a whisper. In the hush of first class, it felt like a microphone. Michael frowned, glancing at the couple across the aisle who turned just enough to eavesdrop without being obvious. He cleared his throat. "Sorry," he said, polite but incredulous. She sighed, one of those exaggerated, exhausted sounds meant to communicate to everyone nearby that she was dealing with a problem. She raised her voice half a notch. "The additional first-class service fee. It's policy on this route. We collect it before takeoff. Didn't you read the terms?" He felt his pulse spike. He had flown this airline before, and he knew there was no such fee. He kept his voice level. "There's no mention of that on my confirmation. I paid the full fare already." She clicked her tongue, turning to the rest of the cabin with a performative roll of her eyes. "Sir," she said, slow and patronizing, "this is first class. We can't comp these amenities." The businessman in 3C shifted, lips curling in a private smirk. Michael swallowed, feeling heat crawl up his neck. He tried once more. "I'm sorry, but I think you're mistaken. Can you show me where this is stated?" Her lips twitched into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "If you can't afford it, sir," she said, and this time her voice was unmistakably loud, "we can help you find a seat back in economy." The words hung in the air like a slap. A silence settled over the cabin. That special hush that means everyone is definitely listening while pretending not to. A woman 2 rows ahead coughed pointedly, tilting her head as if to see better. The couple beside him stiffened, eyes darting away to avoid being dragged in. Michael felt the air tighten in his lungs. He clenched the armrest, so hard his fingers ached. He wanted to stand up and shout. He wanted to demand she get her supervisor, the captain, the entire executive board. But he could already see how that would play. Disruptive, aggressive, causing a scene. He had learned the script too well. Instead, he ground out the words between his teeth. "I'm not moving. I paid for this seat. There's no extra fee." She let the silence build, savoring it, letting everyone hear the defiance in his voice. Then she laughed. Not kindly, not apologetically. She laughed the way you laugh at a child who thinks they're an adult. "Sir," she said with mock sweetness, "we don't make the rules. We just enforce them. If you want to argue, you can do it in the galley while security is called. Or you can just pay now and stop holding up the rest of the cabin." A ripple of discomfort spread through first class, but no one spoke up. No one said, "Hey, he's right. There's no such fee." They just looked away, sipped their drinks, pretended to read their tablets. Michael saw it all, the way people chose their silence. He forced himself to unclench his hands, wipe them on his slacks. "How much?" he asked, voice flat. She smiled like a cat with a trapped mouse. 300, she said lightly, like it was a tip for good service. He exhaled shakily, hating himself, hating her, hating the way the other passengers watched as if this were the in-flight entertainment. He pulled out his card. She snatched it quickly, processed it with her little handheld device that beeped in the most humiliatingly loud chirp imaginable. She handed it back without meeting his eyes. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said in that perfect customer service voice, now dripping with smugness. She didn't offer him a drink. She didn't ask what meal option he wanted. She just turned and walked away, already chatting sweetly with the older couple in 2B. Her voice honeyed once more. Michael could hear them laugh. He heard the words some people spoken in a condescending drawl and knew exactly who they meant. He looked down at his lap, card still clutched in white-knuckled fingers, the receipt blinking on his phone screen like a neon sign that read, "You don't belong." He couldn't even drink the water she'd begrudgingly given him before. It tasted like defeat. He leaned his head back against the plush leather headrest, letting his eyes drift over the rows of quiet passengers around him. They avoided eye contact now, busily checking emails, flipping pages of magazines they weren't really reading. He exhaled shakily, not trusting his voice if he spoke. He thought of saying something anyway. But there it was again, that instinct. The lesson. Don't give them what they want. Don't confirm their worst assumptions. Don't be angry. So he swallowed it down like acid and stared at the back of the seat in front of him. He wasn't going anywhere. He wouldn't move. And they knew it. Michael sat rigid in his seat, the faint vibration of the taxiing plane humming through the soles of his polished shoes, the receipt for the bogus service fee still glowing on his phone screen like a badge of humiliation. His jaw ached from grinding his teeth. Every muscle in his shoulders was taut as piano wire, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him shift uncomfortably. He watched the other passengers settle in with a practiced ease that stung now more than ever. They were comfortable. They were safe. They belonged. He could feel the eyes that occasionally darted in his direction. They were wary, curious, but not sympathetic. They were waiting for him to break, to raise his voice, to become the angry stereotype they all suspected he was. The air seemed thinner in first class. He tried to force a deep breath, feeling it catch halfway in his chest. The attendant who had shaken him down for the fake fee was now gone, replaced by her colleague, a tall man with perfect hair and an artificial grin, so wide it could have been airbrushed on. He approached Michael's row with calculated calm, voice pitched just low enough to seem private while still audible to the surrounding passengers. "Sir, is there going to be a problem today?" he asked, the words dripping with false concern. Michael blinked, thrown for half a heartbeat by the tone. He opened his mouth, then snapped it shut, trying to gauge the trap. "Excuse me," he managed, voice cool. The man smiled wider, teeth flashing like a warning. "We just want to make sure everyone is comfortable," he said. "We can't have any misunderstandings, especially if someone wants to make this about something it's not." The words sat between them, toxic and unspoken. Michael felt the heat rise in his face, but he held steady. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he said, enunciating each word. The man chuckled, shaking his head in mock exasperation. He leaned in conspiratorially. "Don't turn this into a race thing, okay?" he said, voice oozing condescension. "We're just enforcing policy. If you can't follow the rules, economy is still boarding." The surrounding rows shifted uncomfortably. A woman in the row ahead pretended to adjust her scarf, but angled her ear clearly toward them. The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat, but didn't speak. Michael's stomach twisted. He glanced up at the attendant, watching that polished, trained smile. He could see the satisfaction in the man's eyes at the trap he'd laid. If Michael protested too loudly, he'd be making it about race. If he stayed silent, he'd be admitting defeat. He swallowed, forcing down the bile in his throat. "I paid. I'm staying," he said, voice flat. The attendant's smile didn't waver. "Good choice," he said softly. "We wouldn't want a scene." He stood straight and clapped his hands quietly twice, as if dismissing a pet. "Enjoy your flight," he added before gliding away with that same predatory grace. Michael watched him disappear down the aisle, his vision blurring for a second with unshed tears of rage he refused to let fall. He wiped his palms on his slacks under the armrest lip, forcing himself to blink until the burning faded. But it wasn't over, not even close. Moments later, the two attendants gathered near the galley at the front of the cabin. Michael couldn't see them, but the hush in first class made their quiet conversation carry just enough to reach him. He heard a snort, a muffled laugh, then words clear enough to freeze his blood. "I mean seriously," the woman's voice, the one who charged him the fake fee, dripped with scorn. "He acts like this is some civil rights protest." A low, masculine chuckle followed. "Right? Like he's Rosa Parks or something. Please." They both laughed short and mean. Michael's hands trembled. He pressed them flat against the tray table, trying to steady himself. He heard her continue, her voice dropping slightly, but not enough to hide the venom. "We just have to keep first class, you know." Another laugh. "Yeah, keep it classy." She stressed the word with sarcasm, so thick it was a slap in the face. He felt the blood roar in his ears. He wanted to stand up, to walk over there and confront them, to demand the captain, to make them say it to his face. But his body felt heavy, nailed to the seat by decades of learned survival. The voice in his head sounded like his father's, low and resigned. "Don't give them what they want. Don't let them say you lost control. Don't give them an excuse to make you the villain." He forced himself to breathe slowly. In, out. The couple across the aisle was studiously silent, their eyes locked on their tablets. But Michael saw the way their fingers paused, the way their shoulders tensed. They heard it too, but they said nothing. One row back, a businessman tried to pretend he was asleep, but Michael caught the corner of his eye cracked open, watching, waiting. The laughter in the galley died down, replaced by the rustle of service carts and the hollow clink of glassware. Michael leaned his head back and closed his eyes, letting the murmur of the engines try to drown out the acidic words replaying in his mind. He wasn't surprised, but it still hurt. It always hurt. A few minutes later, the male attendant reappeared, taking his time as he handed out drinks with warm, practiced charm. "Pinot for you, sir?" "Very good choice," he said to the older man in 1C. "Sparkling water with lime, ma'am?" "Absolutely," he cooed at the well-dressed woman ahead. When he reached Michael's row, he paused, glancing down at him with cool disinterest. He didn't even ask. He simply dropped a plastic cup of tap water onto Michael's tray with a dull thud. No eye contact, no words. Then he moved on. Michael's hand hovered over the cup, fingers curling before he could stop them. He pulled them back. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of watching him toss it at their feet, no matter how much he wanted to. He stared at the rippling surface of the water, seeing his own reflection distorted, warped. He felt the anger coil inside him, slow and venomous. He wasn't done. He wouldn't forget. He wouldn't move. And for the first time, a different thought crept in, cold, deliberate, and unfamiliar. He wouldn't forgive. Michael sat in silence, the plastic cup of warm tap water mocking him on the tray. The laughter he'd overheard in the galley still rang in his ears, mingling with the roar of the engines as the plane climbed into cruising altitude. He felt a tight, coiled fury in his chest, a weight that pressed against his ribs until every breath was an effort. But he kept it contained. That was the deal. That was always the deal. Don't react. Don't give them fuel. Don't become the problem they were itching to label him as. He forced himself to stare blankly ahead, willing his heartbeat to slow. But the reprieve didn't last. The lead flight attendant reappeared with 2 colleagues in tow, forming a little wall of polite authority in the aisle. She held a slim black binder clutched against her chest like a shield. Her smile was brittle, all customer service performance for the benefit of the cabin, but her eyes were hard and cold. She cleared her throat delicately. "Sir," she began in a tone laced with false courtesy, "I'm going to need to speak with you about your behavior." Michael blinked, his fingers curling against the armrest. He kept his voice even. "My behavior?" She nodded, pressing her lips together. She flipped open the binder, scribbling something quickly. "We have received multiple complaints that you're being disruptive and confrontational. We can't have that in first class." The words hit him like a slap. He almost laughed at the audacity of it. But he didn't. He swallowed the bitter taste rising in his mouth and forced his voice to stay calm. "I haven't done anything except ask why you charge me an extra fee that no one else has to pay." She sighed in a way that suggested he was a child who wouldn't listen. "Sir, please, let's not escalate this." She turned slightly, making sure the other passengers were listening. "We're just trying to ensure everyone has a comfortable flight. We can't have anyone causing unnecessary tension or making others feel unsafe." Michael felt the blood drain from his face. Unsafe. That was the magic word, wasn't it? The one that could justify anything. He opened his mouth to protest, but one of the male attendants leaned in, voice pitched low and firm. "If you continue to resist, we'll have no choice but to notify the captain and arrange for security to meet you upon landing. Is that what you want?" Michael's breath caught. He could feel the other passengers watching, pretending not to watch. The couple across the aisle sat rigid, eyes glued to their screens, but their fingers were white-knuckled on their armrests. The businessman in the next row was openly listening, his lip curled in faint disgust. But at whom? Michael didn't know anymore. He felt the humiliation simmer under his skin, hot and nauseating. He shook his head slowly. "I just want to sit in the seat I paid for," he said quietly. The lead attendant didn't soften. Instead, she clicked her pen once, marking something in the binder. "We'll be making a note of this for our incident report," she said. "I'm officially logging you as a disruptive passenger." Her colleague added, "which will go on your record with the airline for future flights." Michael felt a flash of panic. He forced it down, but it flickered in his eyes, and she saw it. She smiled thinly. She had him. He could see the calculation in her expression, the quiet triumph. "Look," she added, her tone dropping into something that was supposed to sound reasonable, conciliatory. "We're not unreasonable. We're willing to make a compromise here. If you want to stay in first class, we just need you to settle the full premium fee, double what you paid." Michael's mouth went dry. He felt the blood pounding in his ears. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Double," he repeated flatly. She gave a small, theatrical shrug. "Or," she said sweetly, "we can reseat you in economy, where things might be simpler." He scanned their faces. No apology, no shame, just the cold, bureaucratic finality of people who knew they had the upper hand. Around him, the silence from other passengers was deafening. No one spoke up. No one offered to help. He heard a muffled cough from somewhere, the rattle of ice in a glass, the rustle of pages turning too loudly in a magazine. He looked at the credit card in his wallet, felt the weight of it in his palm. He thought about saying no, about refusing to move, about making them drag him out. But he could see the headlines already. Unruly passenger removed from first class. He could imagine the stories those same people would tell their friends. He was so angry, so unreasonable. We were scared. He exhaled shakily, fighting the tremor in his hands. The lead attendant's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing his hesitation. She tapped the binder once, as if to remind him they were keeping score. "Well," she asked, voice light but edged with steel. Michael swallowed hard. "Fine," he heard himself say. The word was lead in his mouth. She brightened immediately, fake warmth flooding her voice like a faucet turned on. "Wonderful choice," she said. She pulled out the handheld card reader with smooth precision. "Just slide your card here. It'll only take a moment." He did it. He watched the screen blink, approved in cheerful green letters. She printed the receipt with an annoyingly loud buzz and handed it to him with a satisfied smile. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said, voice like syrup, turning away before he could even muster a response. He stared at the receipt in his lap, the numbers blurring as his eyes burned. He blinked furiously, refusing to let the tears fall. The plane vibrated gently around him, a small world at 35,000 feet where justice didn't seem to apply. He glanced out the window at the endless expanse of white clouds, feeling like he was suffocating even in all that space. He heard the hush of the attendants retreating, the quiet murmur of passengers resuming polite conversation, carefully ignoring the elephant in the cabin. Michael closed his eyes, willing himself to disappear into the leather of the overpriced seat, as the threat of removal still lingered like a storm cloud that hadn't broken yet. Michael sat there, the receipt for the second service fee still warm from the machine, pressed between his fingers like a personal verdict of guilt. His face was a carefully arranged mask of blankness, but inside he felt like someone had split open his ribs and set fire to whatever hope or dignity was left. The attendants retreated to the galley, their fake smiles relaxing into the private smirks of conspirators who thought their victim couldn't see. He heard a faint laugh, clipped off quickly when the male attendants saw Michael watching. Michael turned away, staring hard at the window, watching nothing. But he wasn't alone in the humiliation. The passengers weren't subtle anymore. It was as if the payment, the surrender, had given them permission to drop the last pretense of polite indifference. The couple across the aisle shifted with theatrical discomfort. The woman clutched her designer wrap closer, avoiding his eyes as if he were contagious. The man, emboldened by silence, leaned back in his seat and muttered just loud enough to carry. Well, at least he finally paid. Thought he was going to fight us all the way back to coach. He chuckled and shook his head, raising his glass in a lazy salute to no one in particular. Michael didn't react, didn't even blink. His spine felt fused to the seat. He forced himself to take one long, shuddering breath, then another. But the hush was broken. Others began to murmur. A man in the next row leaned toward his seatmate, not bothering to lower his voice much. Honestly, what did he expect? You want the perks, you pay like the rest of us. His companion snorted, voice dripping with performative empathy. Oh, come on, it's not about money. He just wanted to make a scene. Some people love playing the victim. Michael felt the words land on him like thrown stones. He tightened his jaw so hard it ached. He didn't dare turn to look at them, didn't want to see the smug faces and knowing smirks. But he could hear the low laughter, the clink of ice in a glass, as someone toasted the joke. A flight attendant passed by to serve drinks to the couple across the aisle, bending low to chat amiably, voice sugar-sweet. "Another glass for you, sir?" "Of course. We never run out of the good stuff up here." The man barked a laugh. "Not for all of us, right?" The attendant tittered obligingly, eyes flicking to Michael's seat before gliding on. Michael felt something black and heavy sink into his gut. The service continued as though nothing had happened. The carts rattled gently over the thick carpeting. Crystal glasses clinked. Plates with elaborate presentations of food, glistening under tiny warm spotlights, were handed out with a flourish to each passenger. One by one, they received their meals. The smell of seared steak and buttered vegetables filled the cabin. A flight attendant approached the businessman who had mocked him earlier and offered a wine pairing suggestion. He nodded appreciatively, complimenting the service loudly enough for everyone to hear. And Michael sat there. No one came to him. He waited. Minutes crawled by. His stomach twisted on itself in hunger and nausea. He wasn't sure if he wanted to eat or vomit. He watched the tray tables pop open all around him, gleaming silverware laid out with fussy precision. He heard the appreciative sighs, the clinking of forks. Finally, he raised a hand. The flight attendant, the same one who had threatened security before, met his gaze with glacial indifference. Michael spoke carefully, voice cracking slightly despite himself. "Excuse me, I didn't get my meal." The attendant blinked once, then checked his tablet with exaggerated slowness. "Ah," he said at last, voice painfully polite. "I'm so sorry, sir, but your upgraded payment doesn't cover the full meal experience. That's part of the premium first package." Michael felt the words punch him in the chest. He swallowed, unable to process it for a moment. "The premium first?" he managed, voice ragged with disbelief. The attendant's mouth twitched as if fighting a smile. "Yes, sir. It's a tier above standard first. I'm afraid there's no meal included at your current level. Water is complimentary, of course." He gestured vaguely at the cup on Michael's tray, the water now room temperature and half evaporated. Michael felt the silence close in around him. He knew the others were listening, pretending not to. He heard someone choke back a laugh. He heard a glass tap gently against another in a mock toast. "To premium," someone whispered, and a giggle snaked through the cabin. He closed his eyes. For one terrifying moment, he thought he might scream. That he'd lunge at the attendant and pound his stupid tablet into pieces on the floor. That he'd spit every curse he'd ever known at these smug bastards who thought money had bought them the right to treat him like trash. But he didn't. He sat perfectly still. His fingers dug crescents into the armrest. His breathing sounded too loud in his own ears. The attendant didn't even wait for a response. He simply turned and walked off to serve someone else who deserved it. Michael watched him go with flat, dead eyes. He became aware of the glances darting in his direction, the forced politeness of people carefully not looking, the tiny satisfied smiles on those who were. He heard another glass clink, another muffled laugh. He was alone, more alone than he'd felt in years. And as the plane droned on, high above the clouds, Michael sat in the plush, overpriced seat he'd paid for twice over, empty tray table before him, water untouched, the scent of food thick and taunting. He felt the humiliation solidify into something else, something cold, something that whispered, "Remember this." He wasn't going to forget. He wasn't going to forgive. And he wasn't going to move. Michael sat stone still in his overpriced seat as the minutes ticked by in heavy silence, the quiet punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and muffled laughter from the other passengers who had long since dismissed him as a curiosity. The air was stale with recycled oxygen and unspoken scorn. Every time a flight attendant passed, they offered polite smiles and gracious nods to everyone else, but turned stony and tight-lipped when they met his eyes. He didn't even bother trying to ask for anything now. His tray table sat empty, except for the insultingly warm cup of water that had become a monument to how little they thought he deserved. The smell of butter and roasted meat clung to the cabin air, wrapping around him like a mocking embrace he couldn't shake. He felt hungry, nauseous, furious, and exhausted all at once, but he kept his expression blank. He wouldn't let them see him break. As the plane began its initial descent, the attendants moved with practiced choreography, collecting the remains of the meal service, securing carts, offering final drinks to those who mattered. Michael was skipped over entirely. The same attendant who had demanded the fake service fees and laughed with his co-worker in the galley leaned over to the couple across the aisle, offering the mints and gently placing napkins in their hands with deferential grace. They smiled back, murmuring thank yous, careful not to glance at Michael in the process. Then the lead attendant straightened, smoothing her uniform, and turned to Michael with a cold, tight smile that never reached her eyes. She cleared her throat, a practiced little cough that quieted the nearby rows. She didn't bother lowering her voice. "Sir," she began, every syllable sharp and deliberate, "when we arrive at the gate, you'll be asked to disembark first, so that security can review your payment status and confirm you're cleared for the services you purchased." The words landed like a gunshot in the silence. Heads turned, some slowly, others in quick, shock jerks. The hush that fell over first class was thick and suffocating, a collective holding of breath. Michael felt his heart thud against his ribs. He stared at her, mouth dry, trying to form a response, but the words wouldn't come. She waited a beat to let the humiliation sink in, eyes glittering with triumph at his silence, then turned crisply and walked away. A man in the row behind snorted under his breath. "Security check," he murmured to his companion, failing to hide his amusement. "Guess some people really don't belong up here." The other man laughed softly in agreement. Michael's fingers dug into the armrest, so hard the fake leather creaked. His jaw trembled with the effort to keep it shut. He felt heat crawling up his neck, flooding his face, and he hated that he couldn't stop it. The attendants ignored him now, fluttering from seat to seat, offering platitudes to everyone else, pretending he didn't exist except for that one humiliating declaration. But the worst was still coming. A crackle over the intercom silenced even the murmurs of polite conversation. The captain's voice came on, calm and practiced, but with a clipped edge that made every passenger sit up a little straighter. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be making our final approach shortly. Please remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened. Also, I'd like to advise you that upon landing, we will have to address a minor security issue. We ask for your patience and cooperation as we resolve the matter quickly. The words hung in the cabin like smoke. Michael felt every pair of eyes snap to him, some openly, others through sideways glances and quick, guilty peeks over shoulders. He saw the confusion hardening into suspicion. He saw the curiosity souring into judgment. The man across the aisle leaned back a little, pulling his feet closer as if Michael might lunge at him. The woman beside him clutched her bag to her chest, turning it into a barrier. Michael didn't move. He felt like he was vibrating in place, adrenaline pounding through his veins with nowhere to go. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again as he forced himself to swallow. The captain's voice had sounded so reasonable, so matter-of-fact, but the meaning was clear as day. Security issue, patience and cooperation. He might as well have called Michael a threat outright. The attendants avoided looking at him directly now, but they hovered nearby, watching with the careful anticipation of people who thought they might have to handle something soon. Michael watched them out of the corner of his eye, reading the tension in their shoulders, the forced calm in their voices when they spoke to everyone else. He heard someone clear their throat loudly, a harsh sound of irritation. They should have dealt with this before takeoff, a man muttered from 2 rows ahead, holding us all up for one passenger. Another voice, softer but no less cruel, chimed in. Well, you know how some people are. Always think the rules don't apply to them. Michael's vision blurred for a moment. He blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears come. Not here, not in front of them. He wanted to scream, to stand up and tell them what had really happened, to demand they see him as something other than the caricature they were painting in their minds. But he didn't move. He knew it would only confirm their worst assumptions. He glanced out the window, watching the distant grid of city lights resolve into streets and neighborhoods as they sank lower. He could see cars moving like tiny beads of light, people going about their lives unaware that 30,000 feet above them, he was being paraded as a cautionary tale. He exhaled shakily, trying to steady himself. The intercom crackled again. The captain's voice was smoother now, but no less patronizing. Again, we appreciate everyone's understanding. Please stay seated after landing until security has completed their check. Security. He heard the word repeated in whispers. Security. He felt it settle on his shoulders like a physical weight. He didn't even bother to look around this time. He knew exactly what he would see. He gripped the armrest like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to earth, feeling the plane tilt gently in its final turn toward the runway, the soft whine of the engine's shifting pitch. The city lights grew larger, closer. He could see the runway now, waiting to swallow them whole. The plane touched down with a lurch that jolted Michael forward against the seatbelt, the tires squealing on the tarmac before settling into the rhythmic rumble of deceleration. The cabin shuddered with that peculiar quiet that always followed landing, the hush of relief, of finality. But this time it felt like the hush before a public execution. All eyes were fixed somewhere near him or deliberately anywhere but him. The captain's voice returned, falsely cheerful. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Please remain seated while we address a small security matter before general deplaning begins. The words felt slimy. Michael heard them settle on the passengers around him like a collective permission to judge. He didn't move. He didn't even unbuckle his seatbelt. He sat there, staring straight ahead, the cheap water on his tray table quivering with every tremor of the slowing plane. The flight attendants had vanished into the galley, whispering among themselves, occasionally stealing glances at him, their eyes hard with satisfaction and anticipation. He felt his throat tighten. He thought of every time he'd been told to keep calm, keep polite, don't give them an excuse. He'd played their game, paid their extortion, sat in silence while they mocked him and humiliated him. And now they were going to call security to drag him off the plane first, like a criminal. He breathed out slowly through his nose, forcing the tremble out of his hands. As the plane taxied to the gate, the cabin lights came up fully, bright and harsh, illuminating every watching face. Michael felt their eyes dart to him and then away, feigning embarrassment they didn't really feel. The couple across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, the woman clutching her designer tote to her chest like a shield, the man clearing his throat loudly but not saying a word. He heard the click of the seatbelt signs going dark, but no one moved. The lead attendant emerged from the galley, immaculate and smug, binder in hand like a verdict waiting to be read. She smiled with thin politeness that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir," she said, voice pitched to carry, "please gather your belongings. You'll be escorted off first for verification with security personnel." Michael blinked once, slowly. His face felt like stone. He didn't stand. Instead, he reached into his inside jacket pocket, fingers closing on the slim black phone he'd ignored the entire flight, the one that hadn't buzzed once because he'd set it to silent on purpose. He turned it on, the screen lighting up immediately, the familiar home screen a small comfort in his palm. He tapped one number, just one. He held it to his ear. The attendant paused, frowning. "Sir, now please." Michael ignored her. He waited, listening to the soft click on the other end. A voice picked up, calm and low. He spoke evenly, his voice carrying, deliberate. "Yeah, it's me. Tell the board I'm being detained on my own aircraft by my own employees. At the gate, right now." The hush in the cabin collapsed into something deeper, a sucking silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words were clear, unhurried. They landed like bricks on glass. The attendant's mouth opened, closed. The couple across the aisle gaped at him. The man's fingers spasmed on his armrest. Michael didn't bother looking at them. He kept his eyes forward. He listened to the voice on the other end, calm but suddenly very alert. "Understood, sir. We're on it." He ended the call with a single swipe and set the phone neatly on his thigh. The attendant swallowed, hard. Her fingers twitched around the binder. Michael finally met her gaze. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The jet bridge connected with a muffled thump. The door clicked and swung open with a mechanical hiss that sounded like a breath being held too long finally released. And then there was movement outside. Not the expected uniformed airport security Michael had been threatened with. Instead, two men in tailored suits and lanyards pushed past the boarding agent. Their pace was brisk but controlled, their faces pale with embarrassment and urgency. Behind them, another woman in a sleek Navy uniform, airport operations director, moved quickly but professionally, clutching a tablet to her chest. The first man stepped onto the plane, scanning the first-class cabin. His eyes landed on Michael. He blanched. He straightened, voice tight but respectful. "Mr. Jameson." "Sir." The attendant took half a step back, blinking rapidly. The second man nudged her aside with polite but firm pressure, stepping forward. "We're terribly sorry for this, sir," he said, voice low but clear enough for the cabin to hear. "Please accept our sincerest apologies. This is completely unacceptable." The operations director came up behind them, face tight with professional mortification. She inclined her head deeply. "Mr. Jameson, on behalf of the entire airport authority, I want to personally apologize for this incident. We had no idea you were on board." Michael watched them carefully. His face was still, carved from stone. The attendant's mouth worked silently, eyes flicking from Michael to the suits and back again. Her cheeks went pale, then red. She started to speak, then stopped, her fingers tightening on the binder, so hard the cover bent. The businessman across the aisle let out a strangled cough. His wife's hand shot to his arm, fingers digging in. They both stared, eyes wide, silent. Michael didn't move for a moment. Then, deliberately, he unbuckled his seatbelt. The click was loud in the silent cabin. He stood slowly, smoothing his jacket, every motion unhurried. He felt the weight of every eye on him. He let them look. The suited man swallowed. "Sir." Again. "We're so sorry." Michael finally spoke. His voice was cool, low, even. "I'm sure you are." The attendant flinched. The ground crew fell silent. The cabin was so quiet you could hear the engines cycling down outside. Michael lifted his phone once more, thumb hovering over the screen as he prepared for the next call. Michael lowered his phone slowly, the glow of its screen fading in his palm as he took in the tableau before him. The operations director still stood there frozen, eyes wide with dread. Behind her, the two suited airline executives fidgeted like children caught cheating on an exam. The attendant who had humiliated him all flight long clutched her binder so hard her knuckles turned white, her lips working silently around apologies she no longer remembered how to form. The cabin was a portrait of paralyzed anticipation. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Michael drew in a long, quiet breath. The hush was so complete he could hear the faint hiss of the air conditioning vents overhead and the soft click of the cockpit door as it cracked open just a hair. The captain himself emerged a moment later, blinking as he registered the unexpected guests crowding the forward galley. He was a tall, barrel-chested man with a square jaw and carefully clipped mustache, radiating the easy authority of someone who never got questioned. But the moment his eyes landed on Michael, standing calm and expressionless, his confidence faltered. His gaze slid to the operations director, seeking an explanation, but found only her tense, apologetic stare. One of the suited executives cleared his throat. It was a miserable, thin little sound that tried to fill the vacuum, but failed completely. He forced himself to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice cracking just slightly before he smoothed it out, "I'm going to ask everyone to please remain in their seats for just a moment. There's a matter of company business we need to address immediately here on board." The words felt wrong in the polished space of first class. Company business wasn't supposed to happen here, not in front of the carefully curated elite. A ripple of confusion, and then offense, traveled through the cabin. A woman in the second row shifted, scowling. "What is this?" "We have connections to make," she snapped. But the executive ignored her completely, his entire focus trained on Michael. Michael didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence was its own challenge. He let it stretch until it felt like it was going to snap. The second executive found his voice. He stepped closer, but not too close. "Mr. Jameson, sir, we'd like to extend our sincerest apologies for what happened during this flight. It's unacceptable." The word caught in his throat like he wasn't used to saying it. Michael tilted his head slightly, studying the man with the faintest trace of interest, as though seeing a strange animal for the first time. His eyes were cool and clear and unblinking. The cabin waited in absolute silence. Even the passengers who had mocked him earlier were staring now, jaws slightly agape, drinks forgotten on tray tables. The lead flight attendant swallowed hard, her cheeks flushing red. She took a tentative step forward, binder pressed like a shield to her chest. "Sir," she began, voice shaky. Michael's gaze snapped to her, and she fell silent instantly, lips clicking shut with an audible smack. One of the executives turned to the crew, his voice clipped now, a corporate lawyer's precision replacing his earlier apology. "All cabin staff," he ordered, "remain at the front. Do not address Mr. Jameson directly unless spoken to." The effect was instantaneous. The other attendants froze. Their professional smiles curdled into masks of fear and embarrassment. The captain cleared his throat, the sound like gravel scraping on metal. "Mr. Jameson," he said formally, voice too loud in the hush, "I apologize for any misunderstanding." Michael finally spoke. His voice was low level, but carried in the silence with perfect clarity. "Captain," he said, "I don't think there's been any misunderstanding at all. I think everyone here understood exactly what they were doing." The words landed with the weight of a dropped anvil. No one replied. He let that silence hang there for a heartbeat. Then, too, letting them squirm in it. Finally, Michael took a single step forward, closing the distance just enough to loom, without seeming to try. He looked at the entire cluster of staff, letting his gaze sweep over the captain, the attendants, the executives who had come groveling. "Here's what's going to happen," he said softly. He didn't need to raise his voice. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "You're going to take these names," he nodded at the staff, "and you're going to write me a detailed incident report. Every moment, every word, every action. I want it in my office, within 2 hours of us getting off this plane." The lead attendant let out a strangled little noise, somewhere between a sob and an objection. But Michael didn't stop. "You're also going to submit your personal statements, and you'll include in those statements why you thought this was acceptable, why you thought extortion and public humiliation were appropriate customer service strategies." The captain's face went beet red. He opened his mouth, then shut it again with an audible click. The operations director shifted uncomfortably but nodded, eyes darting to the executives for guidance. One of them jerked his head in a silent command. She fumbled for her tablet, already tapping in notes with frantic precision. Michael's gaze swung back to the passengers. For the first time, he let himself see them, not just the staff but the well-heeled, well-fed customers who had laughed, who had toasted to his humiliation, who had turned away when they could have spoken up. He didn't say anything to them. He didn't have to. He watched them squirm in their seats, looking everywhere but at him, cheeks flaming, fingers trembling on their crystal glasses. He turned back to the staff one last time. "Now," he said calmly, "tell your people to clear the jet bridge. I don't want to be bothered on my way out. And you." He let his gaze land on the lead attendant with the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Will escort me off this plane." Silently, she let out a soft, choking sound. Eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. The captain swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing. The executives nodded furiously, the older one leaning in to whisper something to the operations director, who turned and fled toward the door to relay orders to ground crew. Michael didn't move yet. He stood there, perfectly balanced, as though the entire cabin were a courtroom, and he was waiting for the verdict to echo back at him. He let the silence stretch, oppressive and inescapable. He watched them all try to look away. He didn't let them. Michael stood silent in the aisle, eyes sweeping over the assembled flight crew, the hush of first class as brittle as glass about to shatter. The passengers squirmed under the weight of the truth that had just been unveiled, each of them frozen in awkward complicity. He watched the lead attendant clutching her binder, so tight it bent under her grip, her face pale and drawn, eyes darting anywhere but at his. The captain stood stiff-backed, jaw clenched, rage and humiliation fighting for dominance in his reddening face. The executives beside them shifted uncomfortably, suits rumpled from their scramble onto the plane, sweat beating at their temples despite the cool air. Outside, through the open door, the bright artificial lights of the jet bridge spilled harshly into the cabin. Shapes moved in hurried choreography, airport security, ground crew, more dark suits converging with tablets and hushed voices, trying to contain the fallout before it spread further. The operations director returned, breathless, tablet clutched in both hands like a lifeline. She looked at Michael and visibly swallowed, forcing herself to maintain eye contact as she spoke. "Mr. Jameson, sir, the executive team is waiting outside to personally apologize. They've cleared the jet bridge. No passengers will be allowed to exit until you're ready. Security is in place to ensure your privacy." Michael's expression didn't flicker. He simply nodded once, an imperceptible shift that somehow felt like a final judgment. The operations director turned sharply on her heel, barking low, hurried instructions to the ground crew waiting outside. The senior airline executive, gray-haired, deeply lined, his authority cracking at the edges, took a tentative step closer to Michael, voice pitched low but clear enough to carry to the nearest rows. "Sir, we recognize the gravity of what's happened here today. It is unacceptable, unconscionable. We are prepared to address it immediately." Michael raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. He let the silence fester, let the man twist in it. The executive cleared his throat, straightening. His eyes hardened slightly, less out of defiance, and more like a man resigned to carrying out an unpleasant duty. He turned abruptly to the captain and the lead flight attendant. "Remove your name badges," he said coldly. The captain's jaw worked furiously. His eyes flashed with something that might have been panic, but he caught it just in time, biting it back into simmering anger. Slowly, mechanically, he reached up and unclipped the small gleaming badge on his uniform, his fingers shaking as he handed it over. The lead attendant let out a ragged exhale that sounded like it hurt. She fumbled with her own badge, nearly dropping it, finally thrusting it forward with a strangled whimper of protest that never made it past her lips. The executive didn't even look at them. He held out his hand with the icy detachment of a judge accepting evidence at sentencing. When they placed their badges in his palm, he closed his fingers around them with finality. "You're both relieved of duty," he said, voice flat. "Effective immediately. You will exit this aircraft now. You will wait at the terminal office for further instructions. Company security will escort you." A collective inhalation filled the cabin. Even the other flight attendants recoiled slightly, eyes darting between their disgraced colleagues and the floor. The captain opened his mouth, chest heaving with outrage, but the executive's glare cut him off mid-inhale. The words died on his tongue, leaving only the wet click of his jaw snapping shut. The lead attendant let out a thin sob, but choked it down, blinking rapidly as tears blurred her vision. Michael watched without a word, arms folded loosely across his chest, expression unreadable. The two stripped crew members shuffled slowly down the aisle, the long walk of shame. The captain kept his back ramrod straight, his face twisted into something ugly and tight. The lead attendant didn't even try to hide her tears anymore, the binder now limp in her shaking hands. As they passed Michael, neither one met his gaze. He didn't bother turning his head to follow them. He simply let them go. They stepped onto the jet bridge, and the ground crew parted around them without a word. A man in a dark blazer, company security, fell into step behind them, shepherding them away from the door with the cold efficiency of someone who had done this before. The executive let out a long, weary breath, then squared his shoulders and faced the remaining crew and passengers. "I want to be absolutely clear," he said, voice pitched to carry across the entire first-class cabin. "This is not who we are. This is not how we will do business." He turned back to Michael, and for the first time his expression cracked, genuine remorse leaking through the corporate mask. "Sir, on behalf of this airline, I accept full responsibility for what was done to you today. It was wrong. It was shameful, and it ends here." He glanced at the operations director, who jumped slightly at the unspoken command. She swallowed and stepped forward, voice shaking just a little. "Effective immediately, we are launching a full-scale internal review. Every member of the flight crew will submit written statements about this incident within the next 2 hours. We are also instituting mandatory anti-bias and sensitivity training for all customer-facing staff, starting this week. No exceptions." A murmur of surprise and discomfort rippled among the remaining attendants. The younger one, who had smirked at Michael earlier, looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. The operations director pressed on, voice firmer now, gaining conviction. "Furthermore, we will be contacting you personally to arrange restitution for this experience. All expenses for this flight will be reimbursed, and we will cover any additional costs or delays you've incurred today." She hesitated, then added, voice dropping, "And if you wish, sir, we will ensure that none of the individuals responsible for this event ever works another route you fly." Michael listened in silence, expression unchanged. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some ashamed, some terrified, some squinting at him with the greedy curiosity of people watching a real-time corporate execution. He didn't say anything yet. He let them all wait. He let them feel it, because for the first time on that entire flight, he wasn't the one squirming in his seat. Months passed like the slow ticking of a clock in a quiet waiting room, each day stretching out, filled with the consequences of that single flight that had refused to fade into corporate memory. Headlines might have died down, but the airline didn't forget. Neither did its staff. Michael Jameson watched it all unfold from a deliberate distance, attending board meetings, reviewing policy changes, signing off on budgets for new training initiatives. He was meticulous, exacting. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply made it clear he would see it through. Every time an executive tried to soften the reforms or cut the budget line for bias training, he'd raise an eyebrow just slightly, and they'd fall silent, pen moving reluctantly but inevitably to approve the changes. Meanwhile, the staff involved in that flight faced their own reckonings. The captain's dismissal had made the rounds in hushed whispers among pilots everywhere. It wasn't just the loss of the uniform or the title. It was the publicness of it, the disgrace of being marched off the plane in front of passengers who could afford lawyers and newspapers and boardroom seats. For weeks, he disappeared from all contact. Rumor had it he'd gone to stay with a brother out west, nursing bitterness and a bottle in equal measure. But the airline's HR department was under orders, direct orders from aboard, to reach out to the fired crew, offering them a way back in. Conditional. Strict. But there, the lead flight attendant took longer. She refused the first approach, hissing at the HR rep who met her in a cramped coffee shop near the airport. Her hair was tied back hastily, dark crescents under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She accused them of wanting her back only to humiliate her again. She demanded back pay. She threatened to sue. She wept when she realized no lawyer would take the case. But time wore her down. Bills came due. Job applications went unanswered when the reference check hit that fatal note of terminated for cause. Eventually, she picked up the phone and called back, voice raw with defeat. They didn't offer her a return to the cabin. Not yet. First came training. Long hours in windowless conference rooms with anti-bias consultants brought in at Michael's insistence. People who didn't let her hide behind tears or angry muttering. She watched videos of passengers describing racism in real time, listened to actors reenact confrontations that made her flush with remembered shame. She spoke once, voice cracking, admitting she hadn't even realized she sounded cruel until the replay. Other times, she sat in stony silence, refusing to speak at all. Then, at the urging of the program director, she began volunteering at a local community center the airline partnered with for outreach. It wasn't glamorous work. She sat in folding chairs with teenagers who'd had worse words than hers flung at them daily, who asked with cynical eyes what she was doing there. She didn't have an answer the first day, or the second. Eventually, she found one. She told them exactly what she'd done. She told them exactly what it had cost her. She didn't sugarcoat it. She explained why it was wrong, the words burning in her throat like acid but coming out anyway. She answered their questions. She took their accusations. She let them judge her. By the end of 6 months, she hadn't transformed into a saint, but she knew what she'd done. She carried it like a scar. When the airline finally offered her a chance to reapply, this time not as lead, but as a junior attendant on domestic routes, she didn't hesitate. She showed up to training early every day. She didn't laugh at the jokes about demanding customers. When they role-played difficult passenger interactions, she didn't roll her eyes or sigh in exasperation. She listened. She practiced. She got it wrong. She tried again. The captain's path was different, but no less humbling. After months of forced leave, he met with HR and senior flight operations leadership in a glass-walled conference room that felt too bright, too exposed. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit anymore, the lines around his eyes deeper, mouth set in a grim, flat line. He didn't try to argue this time. He just listened as they laid out the conditions. If he wanted a second chance, he'd complete the same bias and de-escalation training. He'd serve as a first officer for at least 6 months. He'd submit to unannounced performance audits on every flight. He'd undergo counseling sessions. He took it. He went through the modules, sat next to young pilots who remembered his name for all the wrong reasons. He didn't speak much, but he listened. He watched the videos. He forced himself to see it from the other side. He wrote an essay, mandatory for reinstatement, describing the incident in his own words, admitting how he'd let bias warp his judgment. HR flagged it for review. Michael himself read it. He marked it with notes. he sent it back for revisions 3 times. The captain rewrote it every time, lines growing clearer, more honest. When they finally approved it, it wasn't because it was pretty. It was because it was true. And so, one morning 6 months later, a newly reinstated captain in a freshly pressed uniform walked back onto the jet bridge. He glanced at his badge with a small, self-aware grimace before pinning it carefully to his chest. He boarded the plane first, as protocol dictated, and waited in the cockpit for his first officer to arrive. He went through the checklist meticulously, voice steady but softer than it had been before. And when boarding began, he insisted on standing at the cockpit door, nodding politely at every passenger. An older black couple stepped on, the husband giving him a wary, assessing look. The captain didn't flinch. He met their gaze squarely, nodded again. "Welcome aboard," he said, voice calm. "Thank you for choosing us." They nodded back, slowly. Michael wasn't on that flight. He didn't have to be. But he read the report the next morning in his office. He sat back in his chair, the early sunlight slicing across his polished desk, and let himself close his eyes for one long moment. When he opened them, he signed off on the final reinstatement. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. A promise that next time might be better, that maybe people could change. And that was enough. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Which moment in the story hit you hardest? What would you have done in Michael's place? Let's talk about it below.